Over the weekend, on Saturday, President Trump became the first president ever to go for two for two in impeachment acquittal. So he's been impeached twice. It happened basically within the space of a year. And he was acquitted twice by the Senate. This time, there were more votes to impeach him or convict him in the Senate than there were last time around. Last time, it was a straight party vote with only Mitt Romney breaking ranks. This time, there were 7 Republicans breaking ranks, according to ABC News, exactly a month and a week after insurrectionists incited a riot at the Capitol on January 6th. And you got to love the loaded language there from ABC News. Former President Donald Trump's second impeachment trial came to a climactic end on Saturday afternoon, with Trump being acquitted for his alleged role in inciting the deadly event. A majority of senators voted to convict, but failed to reach the supermajority threshold needed for conviction. Trump said in a statement, "This has been yet another phase of the greatest witch hunt in the history of our country. No president has ever gone through anything like it. It continues because our opponents cannot forget the almost 75 million people, the highest number ever for a sitting president, who voted for us just a few short months ago." He's not totally wrong about this particular fact. The reality is that since he was elected in 2016, there were many, many people who simply could not accept the fact that Trump was president. And then there were a lot of people who were so upset that 75 million Americans voted for him in November that they attempted to essentially lump in all of those people with the Capitol rioters. I've been saying this since the day it happened. It was pretty obvious that the left wing and media agenda here was to lump everybody in together with the people who committed actual criminal and evil acts on January 6th. President Trump said, "Our historic, patriotic, beautiful movement to make America great again has only just begun. In the months ahead, I have much to share with you. I look forward to continuing our incredible journey together to achieve American greatness. For all of our people, there has never been anything like it." Drama ensued on the Senate floor on Saturday morning when senators voted to hear from witnesses. So here's the reality here. The reality is that Democrats made it kind of easy on Republicans. I should be frank about this. Democrats blew this one. The reason that they blew this one is because they recognized a simple reality. The longer this trial dragged out, the more Americans were going to ask a very easy question. Why are we doing this? Like really, this is what always happens with impeachments. At the very beginning, there's a fair bit of support for them. And then as they drag on, the polls start to turn against the party that's doing the impeachment. That is particularly true when the person they are attempting to impeach and convict has been out of office for months, because Democrats did not want to call witnesses. They wanted to get this thing done fast. So Democrats made 2 mistakes here. Like very early, they made 2 mistakes. One was they had a snap impeachment in the House. Now, the argument for the snap impeachment in the House was that this happened on January 6th. We'll impeach him by January 10th. We'll get him out of there by January 15th. And then we won't have to worry about the last 5 days, him leading some sort of insurrection. But here's the thing. Democrats didn't believe that, because if Democrats had actually believed that, then they would have moved fast in the Senate, which they did not. Remember, Nancy Pelosi passed the impeachment in the House with essentially a straight party line vote, 10 Republicans voting in favor. And then instead of transmitting the articles of impeachment to the Senate right away, she waited for like a very long weekend in order to get it to the Senate. And by that point, it was basically 5 days from the time that Trump was to leave office anyway. So that wasn't enough time for the Senate to actually do its work. So if the idea is we need to get rid of this guy like ASAP right now because he's so dangerous, then she would have transmitted it right away, which was the explanation for, of course, why they had a snap impeachment in the first place. If, however, the idea here is that you have to punish a president who's no longer in office because we can't let a future president think he can get away with this sort of stuff, well, then you wouldn't have had the snap impeachment, would you? You would have had a full-scale investigation. The House would have done its work. It would have taken months. They would have deposed probably hundreds of witnesses. They would have had to talk to everybody immediately around Trump about his activities that day and immediately before and after. They didn't do any of that. So what that meant is that you ended up with the Democrats basically catching as catch can, which suggests that, again, their strategy here was not really to get a conviction. Their strategy here was almost entirely about painting one side of the political aisle as complicit in January 6th. That's really what this was about. Because, again, if it was about snap impeachment, they would have moved faster in the first place. And then, once they got past Trump leaving office, the rationale for the snap impeachment was gone because he was out. Right now would be the time for the full-scale investigation. So what could have happened? Well, the Senate could have called witnesses. And this is what it came down to over the weekend. There was this really, really bizarre situation in which Democrats reversed themselves on witnesses. So what happened is that there was a Republican congressperson who basically was going to testify that she had talked to Kevin McCarthy, and Kevin McCarthy had talked to Trump, and Kevin McCarthy had told Trump to call off the dogs, and Trump didn't call off the dogs or any of this. And so this came out late on Friday night, early Saturday morning, and the Democrats in the House then voted, you know what, maybe we should call witnesses. And then the Senate Democrats voted, maybe we should call witnesses. And then within an hour, they reversed themselves on Saturday morning and said, you know what, forget it, we're not going to call witnesses, let's just take a vote. According to the Washington Post, The debate among the House impeachment managers raged through the night as the hours and then minutes ticked down early Saturday before what was widely expected to be the final day of former President Donald Trump's Senate trial. After weeks of bending to political pressure to ensure a speeding proceeding, some on the House team wanted to make one final furious push to demand a more intensive investigation, to call witnesses to talk about Trump's behavior before, during, and after the mob attack on the Capitol on January 6th. Right, which again, that is a position that makes sense. If you believe that this was such a grave evil and injustice on the part of Trump, right now, not on the part of the rioters, on the part of Trump, that you required a full-scale 9/11 style commission, well, then you should have done that. And so some of the House impeachment managers were like, okay, well, you know what? I know we're supposed to vote on this thing, but why don't we go ahead and do that? And Senate Democrats initially were like, well, okay. And then they reversed themselves. According to the Washington Post, should they seek to call a Republican lawmaker who is willing to talk about her knowledge of Trump's dismissive comments to the House GOP leader who pled with him during a riot to call off his supporters? Should they call the leader himself, Kevin McCarthy? What about aides to former Vice President Mike Pence, whose dramatic evacuation was caught on security video played for the first time publicly last week? Any of these moves risked extending the proceedings for weeks, but nonetheless, these potential surprise developments consumed the managers late into Friday night and in the wee hours on Saturday, according to multiple Democrats with who are familiar with the deliberations. In the end, the managers backed off, allowing the Senate vote to take place as expected, but not before a chaotic back and forth caught senators off guard, sent Trump's legal team into a fury, and exposed long simmering tensions among Democrats over how aggressively to hold the former president accountable. The debate over witness testimony continued to loom large after the vote, as key questions about Trump's actions and motives remained unanswered. See, this was the big problem. There were two big problems with the Democrats' impeachment push. One was the actual impeachment charge, which centered around incitement. Incitement is very difficult to prove. Suggesting that Trump, quote unquote, incited the riot when he said to peacefully and patriotically march down to the Capitol to show displeasure, that is not a particularly convincing argument. Because again, incitement is a pretty high bar. And suggesting that it was incitement to insurrection is a double high bar. Because, again, you would have to show, number one, that it was incitement, and number two, that Trump actually wanted an insurrection, not just people to go and do something criminal. He wanted an insurrection to overthrow the United States government, which, again, there's very little evidence of. So that was problem number one with all of this. The second problem over all of this is that many of the accusations that were being made about Trump's behavior were being made second or third hand. It was unnamed staffer inside the White House talking to New York Times, and the Democrats didn't bother to call witnesses. They just cited the New York Times report. That ain't going to be good enough to support an impeachment effort. The Democrats put themselves in a very difficult position with this impeachment because they were very inconsistent in their pursuit. First, they said it was a crisis. Then they said it was not a crisis. First, they said that it was about incitement for insurrection. And then they said it was about Trump's general activity between November and January 6th. Well, they didn't try to bring an impeachment charge against him in December, and he was saying exactly the same things in January as he was saying in December, for example. And as it turns out, a lot of the language that they say that Trump was using that was quote-unquote incitement is language that has been used by Democrats over and over. This is the point that Trump's team made on Friday when they were closing their argument. They just played tape over and over of Democrats saying exactly the same kind of stuff that Trump has said, and nobody batting an eye.
In the Senate, Democrats are going to fight like hell to make this a reality.
We are going to fight like hell to protect your vote.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm confident that we're going to fight like hell to make sure they can.
We are going to fight like hell to make sure that everyone who wants to vote can exercise that right to vote.
This election is coming whether the president wants it or not, and we're going to fight like hell in Congress to make sure that the mail still works.
Today, Biden's VP Kamala Harris told supporters in a fundraising note that it is time to, quote, fight like hell to protect the Supreme Court.
Okay, so the fact that the Trump impeachment managers, the defense team, that they were saying, you know, you guys use this kind of language all the time and you have no problem with it. That is accurate. I've said all along, there is no neutral standard that Democrats are going to uphold here in going after Trump on the basis of incitement. If they'd gone for a vaguer charge, I said this early on, if they just wanted to say abuse of power, then it would have given Republicans some wiggle room. But at the same time, it would have given them less wiggle room. On the one hand, more wiggle room because abuse of power is not an actual legal charge. On the other hand, abuse of power is probably a more accurate description of what they think Trump did between November 4th and January 6th. In any case, here was Trump's lawyer saying, you guys keep saying incitement over and over and over. I'm not sure that that word means what you think it means.
At no point in their presentation did you hear the House managers play a single example of Mr. Trump urging anyone to engage in violence of any kind. At no point did you hear anything that could ever possibly be construed as Mr. Trump encouraging or sanctioning an insurrection. Senators, you did not hear those tapes because they do not exist. because the act of incitement never happened.
Okay. Meanwhile, the Democrats are still trying to make an excuse for why exactly they didn't call the witnesses. Because again, if they wanted to show not only incitement, but that there was action by Trump on January 6th to, for example, hold up the sending of law enforcement, well, then now would have been the time. Jamie Raskin was trying to make excuses for this. He's like, well, but you know what? No matter what we said, Republicans would have just voted to acquit. Number one, that may very well be true, but that's not the point. The point is that if you wanted to actually bring the strongest possible impeachment charge, what you actually would have done is, the basic research. Here's Jamie Raskin trying to make an excuse for what was very obviously a politically motivated impeachment.
Trump knew exactly what they were doing. He knew that mob which he had deployed was there, occupying people's offices and threatening Congress. So it was there for everybody to see.
Right.
So we could have had 1,000 witnesses, but that could not have overcome the kinds of silly arguments that people like McConnell and Capito are hanging their hats on. They're trying to have it both ways.
Okay, but here's the problem. You still have to provide the evidence. If you don't provide the evidence, you actually leave Republicans with the perfectly plausible defense that you guys didn't provide the evidence of the chief charge that you were attempting to make. But again, this was all political from the get-go. There were 7 Republicans who joined with the Democrats to vote in favor of the conviction. That had been Senators Mitt Romney of Utah, not a surprise, Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Ben Sasse of Nebraska, Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, Richard Burr of North Carolina, and Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. The latter two, kind of interesting. I believe both of those guys are retiring after this particular round because they don't want to be primaried, presumably. There's already some talk of doing that in these particular home states. But it does show that if you're in a purple state, they're less Trumpy in the purple states than they would be in the non-purple states. And that's something that Republicans should keep in mind going forward, which leads to Mitch McConnell's response to all of this. So Mitch McConnell did 2 things. One, he voted against the impeachment because he said, listen, you can't impeach somebody who's already out of office, right? Otherwise, you could just impeach private individuals. That's not what this is really for. But he also slammed Trump in pretty personal terms. It's pretty obvious that McConnell and many in the Republican higher echelon would like to separate off from Trump at this point. Thanks for all the cheese, but we're done at this point. Here's Mitch McConnell going after Trump while simultaneously not voting for his impeachment.
They did this because they'd been fed wild falsehoods by the most powerful man on earth. Because he was angry he lost an election. Former President Trump's actions preceded the riot were a disgraceful dereliction of duty.
Okay, so that is an argument that's been made by a lot of Republicans, is that Trump's behavior here was really, really bad. But what this is really about for McConnell and for a lot of Republicans is minimizing Trump's influence going forward on the party. And you can see why. The reality is that politically speaking, Trump underperformed nearly every Republican across the country in 2020. I know that that is counter to the sort of prevailing view among Republicans, which is that Trump boosted turnout on the right side of the aisle. He did boost some turnout on the right side of the aisle, but not for him, right? He boosted turnout on the right side of the aisle, but he also boosted turnout on the left side of the aisle, which is why Joe Biden, a dead candidate, a person who has not been living for several years, ended up winning 80 million votes in the popular vote. So you can see why McConnell is doing what he's attempting to do here, which is, I'm not going to separate off from the party. I understand that people are using the impeachment as a litmus test of loyalty to the Republican Party. I'm not going to vote against that. At the same time, Trump should not be a key figure going forward. That's McConnell's attempt. Meanwhile, the Democrats are attempting pretty strongly to tie all Republicans to Trump's knee here. Here's Nancy Pelosi suggesting that every Republican is complicit in January 6th, not just Trump, every single Republican who didn't vote in favor of impeachment. That was always the goal here, right? The goal here was never that they were actually going to get a conviction of Trump, or even that they were going to do the legwork necessary to support an impeachment of Trump. Instead, it was really about how can we best politically lump in everybody all together really quickly and then move on with our lives.
Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence, was the chant, and they just dismissed that. Why? Because maybe they can't get another job. What is so important about any one of us? What is so important about the political survival of any one of us that is more important than our Constitution that we take an oath to protect and defend?
Okay, let me just say this about political leaders. When political leaders grandstand this way, you should never believe them, because political leaders are not meant to be moral leaders. They're just not. We're getting to the portion of the Bible in Judaism. Every week we read a different portion of the Bible. We're getting to the portion of the Bible at this point where the Jews build the golden calf. It's right after they receive the Torah, they receive the Old Testament. And then Moses goes back up the mountain and they freak out and they build the golden calf. And the question is, why do they build a golden calf? What's so special about a golden calf? And the reason that they build a golden calf is because they want something that is going to lead them, but also be a reflection of them, right? Something in which they had a part, right? It says in the Bible that all of the Israelites, all the Jews, they take out their nose rings and their earrings and they melt them down and they make this God, right? And then they're going to worship that God. They worship the God, the neon God that they'd made, right? This is what we do with our politicians. We elect these schmucks. Okay, so it's our fault. And then we look to them and we say, why can't they lead us? Well, they can't lead you because they're reflections of you. They're not going to tell you things you don't want to hear. Their literal job is to tell you things that you want to hear. This is what politicians do for a living. So when Nancy Pelosi stands there and she says things like, why do these politicians, why do they think that their own job is so much more important than this institution? Yeah, Nancy, I'm sure that consideration has never crossed your mind under any circumstances. But here's the reality when it comes to Pelosi and the Democrats and this impeachment. It was perfectly obvious what this was from the beginning. As soon as January 6th happened, they saw it not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity for the most part. It was both. It was both for them. It can be both, right? It can be tragedy. It can be a criminal act. It can also be an opportunity politically for them to ram down their entire agenda, which is why they rushed this thing. That they've openly said this, by the way, is that Joe Biden's agenda is more important than taking their time with the impeachment to determine whether Trump is actually guilty and convictable. What this was really about is making the political point and then using that as fuel to push forward Joe Biden's ridiculous agenda. And his agenda is ridiculous. Joe Biden himself put out a statement. He says, it was nearly 2 weeks ago that Jill and I paid our respects to Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, who laid an honor in the rotunda after losing his life protecting the Capitol from a riotous, violent mob on January 6th, 2021. By the way, we're still finding out some of the details as to what exactly happened with Officer Sicknick. The original reports that he was hit in the head with a fire extinguisher apparently are untrue. That doesn't mean he didn't die in defense of the Capitol. We just don't know really much what happened at this point. Biden said today, 57 senators, including a record 7 Republicans, voted to find former President Trump guilty of inciting that deadly insurrection on our very democracy. This Senate vote followed the bipartisan vote to impeach him by the House of Representatives. While the final vote did not lead to a conviction, the substance of the charge is not in dispute. Even those opposed to the conviction, like Senate Minority Leader McConnell, believed Trump was guilty of a quote-unquote disgraceful dereliction of duty and practically and morally irresponsible for provoking the violence unleashed on the Capitol. Okay, well, this would be the time, presumably, for, if that's true, right? If that's what he believes, that it's not in dispute, now would be a good time to recognize that everybody's on the same side, right? But that's not what's going to happen here, right? So Biden says that we have to realize that we all have a duty and responsibility as Americans to defend the truth and defeat the lies. That's how we end this uncivil war. Okay, and the very first move the left makes immediately is, oh yeah, and by the way, you need to agree with all of the elements of our agenda. So Charles Blow over at the New York Times, symbolizing this point of view, he says, Blue Lives Matter is over. Weird. I noticed that you weren't a big supporter of Blue Lives Matter for like this entire time. That in fact, if you said Blue Lives Matter, then Charles Blow got very, very upset with you because he was saying that is some sort of denigration of the idea that Black lives matter if you suggest that police lives matter. But now he says Blue Lives Matter is over. Blue Lives Matter is over because there were people who didn't vote in favor of convicting President Trump in the Senate, which means they don't care about cops. Now, that argument could very well be extended to Black Lives Matter, which obviously does not give two craps about the vast number of black people who are being killed by other black people in the United States. This is a point that has been very well made by a bunch of advocates for civil rights who happen to be on the right side of the aisle, which is that Black Lives Matter, if it wanted to be taken seriously, maybe they ought to worry about things like the vast number of young black men who are being killed by young black men in cities that actually lack a police presence. But Charles Blow would never say that Black Lives Matter doesn't care about black lives because of their absolute willingness to ignore the risk to young black life in removing the police. But here he is saying Blue Lives Matter doesn't matter to all Republicans because they didn't vote in favor of conviction. This is all about the politics. And Democrats never played it any other way. There was no point at which they said that this was about a higher principle, or at which they plausibly said that anyway. It was never about a higher principle. That was obvious from their conduct. It was obvious from how they laid out the charge. And it was perfectly obvious from everything up to and including the very last day of this impeachment when they could have called witnesses and decided not to out of political expedience, one of the Democrats even admitting we just wanted to get home for the weekend. Yeah, that sounds like principle to me, Nancy Pelosi. I hope you enjoyed that clip from The Ben Shapiro Show. If you did, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you stay up to date on all of our future content.